Boston, the proud city of intellect, cobblestone streets, and revolutionary history, had always worn its traditions like a badge of honor. But in the early 1960s, a creeping shadow began to slither across its neighborhoods, an invisible terror that would haunt its citizens for years. Between 1962 and 1964, 13 women were brutally murdered in their own homes. They weren't attacked in dark alleys or isolated parks. No, they were killed in the very places they felt safest. Behind locked doors, in the comfort of their own apartments. Imagine the horror. 13 lives stolen in less than 2 years. The press gave it a name that would forever be etched in American crime history, the Boston Strangler. And the numbers themselves told a story of madness. 13 women dead. Dozens of suspects questioned. Hundreds of officers assigned to the case. Millions of dollars poured into investigations that always seemed to hit a dead end. At first, the cases appeared disconnected. An elderly woman found strangled in her bed. Another discovered lifeless in her living room. But soon a pattern emerged, chilling in its precision. The victims had been strangled, often with their own stockings or pieces of clothing. There were rarely signs of forced entry. It was as though the killer could charm his way inside, as if he was someone they trusted or someone who knew how to disarm fear in an instant. Boston was not prepared for this kind of terror. This wasn't the gangster violence of Prohibition days, or the occasional outburst of neighborhood crime. This was something far worse, a predator lurking in plain sight, choosing his victims at random, invading their private sanctuaries, and leaving behind nothing but silence and questions. And the victims, they weren't all alike. At first, they were older women, living alone, often vulnerable. But as the killings continued, the profile shifted. Young women, in their 20s, vibrant and full of life, suddenly became targets. No woman felt safe, no matter her age, background, or neighborhood. The city's rhythm changed almost overnight. Women began double-bolting their doors, checking the locks again and again before bed. Apartment buildings, once lively with chatter, fell quiet after sundown. Streets emptied earlier in the evening. Hardware stores ran out of locks and chains, and self-defense classes sprang up in gyms and church basements. A wave of paranoia took hold, thick as the winter fog rolling in off the Charles River. It wasn't just fear. It was the kind of fear that reshapes an entire community. A city once bustling with confidence now recoiled in suspicion. Who could it be? The friendly maintenance man, the milk delivery boy, the stranger offering to help carry groceries. Even familiar faces were no longer trusted. The police, already under pressure, scrambled to respond. Dozens of detectives were reassigned to the case, chasing down leads that evaporated as quickly as they appeared. Politicians, desperate to calm the public, promised swift action. But the killings continued, almost mocking the efforts of law enforcement. And the newspapers knew exactly how to fuel the fire. Headlines screamed of another strangler victim, splashed with sensational detail. Reporters swarmed crime scenes, whispering theories, painting lurid pictures of a phantom who slipped through walls and left no trace. For the public, it was not just a series of crimes, it was a nightmare legend unfolding in real time. For the women of Boston, it was personal. Every knock at the door was a potential death sentence. Every creak of the floorboards at night sent shivers down spines. Parents begged their daughters not to live alone. Neighbors formed watch groups, clinging to the hope that vigilance could somehow ward off evil. But the truth was inescapable. The Boston Strangler could be anywhere, at any time. What made it worse was the uncanny detail: these women hadn't fought their way into death. There were rarely signs of a violent struggle. It was as if they had willingly allowed the killer inside, before realizing too late that death had walked through their doorway. That mystery, more than anything, unsettled the city, because if the killer could gain the trust of strangers so easily, then no one was beyond his reach. By the end of 1962, the number of victims had already reached an alarming count. Investigators were drowning in interviews, suspects, and dead ends. But with each body discovered, the fear spread wider, growing into something uncontainable. Boston was no longer a city, it was a chessboard, with an invisible opponent always one move ahead. And in the shadows, the Strangler watched, waiting for his next opportunity. Who would it be? A grandmother sitting alone in her apartment. A young woman answering her door. No one could predict. No one could stop him. This was not just a series of murders. It was psychological warfare. And as 1963 dawned, the people of Boston realized something terrifying. The killings were not slowing down. They were escalating. The nightmare was only beginning. No one knew it yet, But the search for the Boston Strangler would become one of the most infamous manhunts in American history. A desperate, chaotic race against time. And while the killer moved silently through their city, the people of Boston could only whisper one question into the dark. Who's next? The story of the Boston Strangler doesn't begin with a bang, but with a quiet horror that at first seemed almost ordinary. The kind of tragedy that could be explained away until it couldn't. On June 14, 1962, the body of 55-year-old Anna Sleezers was discovered in her Boston apartment. She was a seamstress, a hard-working woman who had survived war, emigration, and hardship, only to meet her end in her own bathroom. She had been strangled with the belt from her bathrobe. At first, police treated the case as a tragic but isolated homicide. Nothing about it suggested the beginning of a storm. But then came the second woman. Only a few weeks later, 68-year-old Mary Mullen was found dead. The cause was at first considered natural heart failure, but in the chaos of later investigations, her death was re-evaluated. It was possible that she, too, had been approached by the same unseen visitor. By late June, the city had yet another body to reckon with. 75-year-old Nina Nichols was discovered in her apartment, strangled with her own stockings. Her body had been posed carefully arranged in a way that felt deliberate, almost theatrical. The scene whispered of something more than murder. It suggested ritual, compulsion, a killer making a statement. And then, only the next day, 67-year-old Helen Blake was found in her home in Lynn, Massachusetts. She too had been strangled, and her body bore the same disturbing signs, left in a position that was almost staged. Investigators could not ignore the similarities anymore. Women, all living alone, older, vulnerable, each killed in their own homes, strangled with fabric or stockings. There was no sign of forced entry, no shattered windows, no broken doors. It was as though the victims had let their killer in willingly. The summer of 1962 had barely begun, and already Boston was sitting on a pattern that was impossible to dismiss. The press began murmuring, the whispers of a strangler echoing in headlines and radio chatter. At this point, police still clung to the hope that the murders might be connected by circumstance rather than a single hand. But the city's unease was beginning to swell. Then came the crime that burned the fear into Boston's collective psyche. On August 19, 1962, 75-year-old Ida Erga was found strangled in her apartment. On the same day, 65-year-old Jane Sullivan's body was discovered as well, in a bathtub, with water still trickling. The city was stunned. 2 women, killed on the same day, both in the supposed safety of their homes. It was a turning point. These were no longer random tragedies. This was a predator moving with increasing boldness, taunting the police with his pace. 5 women, all older, all alone, all murdered in similar ways, within a span of 2 months. And most horrifying of all, each of them had seemed to let him in. The police investigation began to swell, but with each new report, they seemed only to be chasing shadows. The killer left behind little physical evidence. No fingerprints that mattered. No clear witnesses. Just a city beginning to unravel, apartment by apartment. The victims themselves told a silent story. Women who had lived their lives quietly, who trusted their neighbors, who likely opened the door, thinking they were letting in someone ordinary, a repairman, a friendly stranger, or perhaps even someone they had seen before. Whoever the killer was, he could erase suspicion in a heartbeat. He didn't have to break in. He was invited. That, perhaps more than the killings themselves, sent Boston into a state of paranoia. The bodies were not only lifeless, but posed. The way their legs were arranged, the way objects in the room were left, it was as though the killer wanted to leave a signature, something grotesquely artistic. Detectives debated among themselves. Was this the act of one man, or was Boston facing multiple killers who mimicked one another? The question remained unanswered. By late 1962, the press finally gave the phantom a name that stuck: the Boston Strangler. The name itself carried menace, reducing 13 women's futures into a chilling headline that echoed across newspapers and television broadcasts. For ordinary Bostonians, it was more than a label. It was a curse, a shadowy figure who could knock on any door. As the months dragged on, more victims would fall, and the city's fear would deepen. But in these first murders, the template was set. Vulnerable women, trusted doors, a killer who seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish without a trace. A predator who didn't just take lives, he dismantled the illusion of safety within one's own home. The truth was dawning, slowly and painfully. Boston was being stalked by a man who understood not just how to kill, but how to manipulate trust. And worse, he wasn't finished. The early victims were only the opening act of a nightmare that would stretch on for years. By the winter of 1962, Boston was no longer the proud, bustling city it once had been. It had become a place where fear seeped into every corner, every household, every late-night echo in the hallway. The string of murders once thought to be isolated was now clearly the work of a predator, who was not only relentless, but also unpredictable. The city's heartbeat changed. Women who once felt safe walking home after dark now clutched their purses like lifelines, their steps quickening with every shadow. Apartment doors were barricaded, bolts installed on top of bolts, locks doubled and tripled. Hardware stores couldn't keep up with demand. Locksmiths worked overtime, answering desperate calls from residents who wanted their doors fortified against the phantom lurking outside. But the locks weren't enough, because every story, every headline, carried the same eerie refrain. There were no signs of forced entry. The women weren't dragged from the street, weren't broken into at night. They had opened their doors willingly. The terrifying implication was that the killer could be anyone. A delivery man, a handyman, even a neighbor. That paranoia spread faster than the news itself. And then the victim profile shifted, pushing fear into every demographic. The early murders had mostly been of older women, living alone, vulnerable. But in late 1962, the Strangler set his sights on younger prey. 20-year-old Sophie Clark was found strangled in her Boston apartment. She was not elderly, not weak, not frail. She was young, educated, full of life. And yet she too had been killed with her own stockings. This wasn't just shocking, it was shattering. If the killer could strike down someone like Sophie, then no one was safe. 2 weeks later, another young woman, 23-year-old Patricia Bassett, was found murdered in her home. The brutality was the same, the posing of the body equally unsettling. The shift in victimology sent a chilling message. The killer was evolving. He was no longer limiting himself. Age, background, strength of it mattered anymore. Every woman in Boston was a potential victim. The city erupted into hysteria. Newspapers fanned the flames with sensational headlines. Another Strangler victim found. Radios blared warnings. Television newscasts opened with grim updates. Each new body was not just a tragedy, it was fuel for a citywide panic. Boston, once filled with scholars, students, and professionals, now resembled a city under siege. Self-defense classes sprang up in church basements and YMCAs. Women carried whistles, knives, even hammers in their handbags. Roommates insisted on never leaving each other alone. Fathers demanded their daughters move back home. Mothers wept at the thought of their children venturing out alone. For the police, the pressure was unbearable. Dozens of detectives were pulled into the investigation. Hundreds of suspects were interviewed. Each day brought a flood of tips, most of them useless, many of them the result of paranoia rather than evidence. Neighbors turned on neighbors, reporting suspicious glances, strange movements, unfamiliar faces. The police lines were swamped by frantic calls. I saw a man loitering near the building. Someone knocked on my door and then walked away. There's a stranger on the bus who keeps staring. The sheer volume of paranoia buried the investigation in noise. Detectives had to sift through mountains of dead ends, chasing ghosts, while the real killer kept moving, undetected. And the killer seemed to revel in the chaos. Each new murder came like a mocking taunt. He was always one step ahead, slipping through the cracks of a city on high alert. His ability to walk into a victim's home without leaving a trace baffled investigators and horrified the public. It was as though he was invisible, a shadow with a human face. Boston was not the same city anymore. The laughter of children in playgrounds seemed subdued. That once buzzed with conversation now hummed with nervous whispers. And in apartments across the city, women sat wide-eyed in the dark, listening for the smallest creak on the stairs, the faintest knock at the door, terrified of what or who might be waiting on the other side. By early 1963, the Boston Strangler was no longer just a criminal. He was a specter, a myth, a story mothers used to scare their daughters into caution. But unlike ghost stories, this one was real. The police were failing. The murders were piling up, and the entire city was drowning in fear, waiting for the next headline, the next body, the next knock at the door that could be their last. The hunt for the Boston Strangler was unlike anything the city had ever seen. As the bodies continued to appear, detectives threw everything they had into the investigation. The sheer scale was overwhelming. Hundreds of officers, thousands of interviews, entire filing cabinets filled with reports. sketches, photographs, and theories. Boston's homicide division had become a war room, with maps of the city plastered on walls, and pins marking crime scenes that seemed to multiply with every passing month. And yet there was nothing. Nothing solid to grasp. No single piece of evidence to tie the killer to the murders. No fingerprints that matched. No witnesses who could recall a clear face. The killer seemed to move like a phantom, leaving behind only death and confusion. The frustration among detectives grew unbearable. They would arrive at an apartment, look at the lifeless body of yet another woman, and see the same haunting pattern. Strangulation with a stocking or belt. The body posed, no forced entry. The consistency was almost mocking. He was careful, meticulous, and above all, confident. At first, the police had hoped the pattern itself might betray him. But as the murders continued, they began to wonder if they were even dealing with just one man. Some details, very different knots in the stockings, different ways the bodies were arranged. Some victims were older, some much younger. A few were sexually assaulted, others not. Could it really be the work of a single killer? Or had the idea of the Boston Strangler become a mask behind which multiple predators hid their crimes? This theory divided the investigation. Some detectives insisted they were chasing one man, a predator whose tastes were evolving, who was growing bolder and more experimental. Others believed the city was suffering from a plague of copycatsmen, emboldened by headlines, mimicking the Strangler to cover their own crimes. The debate raged inside police headquarters while the public outside cared only about one thing: when would it stop? The police tried everything. They released composite sketches based on fleeting glimpses, often contradicting one another. Some described a tall man with dark hair. Others, a short man with a heavy build. Women who survived suspicious encounters with strangers came forward with stories. A man who tried to force his way into their homes. Another who offered handyman services at the door. Each account sounded plausible, and yet none of them matched. The killer seemed to wear 1,000 faces. Tips poured in, thousands of them, flooding the department. Each one had to be checked, and each one led nowhere. Detectives chased leads into dead alleys, interviewed men who seemed promising only to rule them out. The frustration was palpable. Boston was suffocating under fear, and the men sworn to protect it were drowning in a sea of shadows. Forensic science offered little help. DNA testing was decades away. Crime scene analysis in the 1960s relied heavily on fingerprints, blood typing, and eyewitness testimony, of which proved useless against a killer who knew how to erase himself from the scene. He was careful, methodical, and cruelly aware of the limitations of the time, and so the murders continued. One after another, women were found in their apartments, the same grim calling card left behind. Each case added to the mountain of files, and each case seemed to mock the efforts of law enforcement. The killer was always ahead, always invisible. The city's leaders grew desperate. Politicians demanded results. Newspapers accused the police of incompetence. Boston residents lived in a permanent state of suspicion. A stranger holding a toolbox could be a murderer. A knock at the door could be the end. The Strangler had turned an entire city into a crime scene without leaving a single shred of himself behind. What made the terror even more profound was the psychological warfare at play. The killer wasn't just taking lives, he was breaking trust. The fact that so many women had opened their doors willingly meant the killer had a skill far beyond physical violence. He knew how to manipulate trust, how to speak, how to convince. That ability to walk into someone's home without raising alarm was his deadliest weapon of all. But the detectives pressed on. They followed every scrap of rumor, interrogated hundreds of suspects, and tried to hold back a press corps, hungry for sensational headlines. And yet the question lingered, gnawing at the investigation from within. Were they even chasing the right man? Or was Boston being haunted by more than one monster, each wearing the mask of the Strangler? In the end, the evidence pointed in every direction, and in none. The clues were there, scattered like pieces of a puzzle. But the picture refused to come together. All that remained was a terrifying certainty. While the police searched in circles, the Strangler was still out there, choosing his next victim. By 1964, Boston was choking on fear, and the investigation was collapsing under its own weight. Hundreds of suspects had been questioned, but no one had been charged. The Strangler had become less a man than a mython, invisible phantom haunting the city. And then, in one of the most unexpected turns in criminal history, the name Albert DeSalvo emerged from the shadows. On the surface, DeSalvo was not the monster people had imagined. He was not the brooding figure hiding in dark alleys, or the cold-eyed predator in crime novels. To most who knew him, He seemed ordinary to ordinary. A father, a husband, a man who worked jobs that required him to move constantly around the city. He blended in, unnoticed, like background noise. But beneath that bland exterior lurked something deeply disturbing. DeSalvo's criminal history stretched back years, and it told a story of escalating obsession. He wasn't first known as a killer, but as a prowler, a man who broke into women's homes, not to rob, but to terrify. In one of his earliest crimes, he earned the nickname the Measuring Man. He would pose as a modeling scout, offering women the chance to join a fake modeling agency. Once inside their homes, he would take out a measuring tape and insist on measuring their bodies under the guise of professional requirements. It was creepy, manipulative, and degrading, but at the time, it rarely led to formal charges. Later, he became known as the Green Man, a serial sexual offender who dressed in green work clothes and posed as a handyman to gain entry into women's apartments. Once inside, he would assault them, often without leaving lasting physical harm, but always leaving psychological scars. These crimes alone made him notorious among investigators of sexual assault in Boston. Yet, despite dozens of reports, DeSalvo slipped through the cracks again and again. Protected by a system that couldn't yet fully comprehend the escalating danger of a man like him. It wasn't murder that finally put Albert DeSalvo behind bars. It was burglary. In 1964, he was arrested for breaking and entering. And while in custody, he faced a series of charges for his sexual assaults as the Green Man. For the police, it was a relief they had finally captured one of Boston's most prolific offenders. But no one at that point connected him directly to the Boston Strangler murders. The revelation came in the most unlikely of ways. Through a confession whispered in prison. DeSalvo shared a cell block with a man named George Nassar, himself a convicted killer. One day, DeSalvo told Nassar that he was the Boston Strangler, responsible for the murders that had shaken the city. Nassar, perhaps out of strategy or self-interest, relayed this confession to his attorney, F. Lee Bailey, the same man who would later gain national fame defending high-profile clients. Bailey immediately recognized the potential significance and pressed for DeSalvo to share more details. And DeSalvo did. In chilling detail, he described the murders, the way he gained entry into the apartments, the way he used the victims' own clothing as weapons, the strange compulsion to pose their bodies afterward. He knew details that had never been released to the public, specifics about crime scenes, about knots, about positions of objects in rooms. For investigators desperate for answers, it was as though the puzzle pieces had finally snapped into place. Yet the fit wasn't perfect. Some details were off, others contradicted the evidence. Still, the possibility that DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler ignited a firestorm. For the first time, the city had a name, a face, a man they could point to and say, "This is him. This is the monster who haunted us." The public reaction was a mixture of relief and disbelief. Could it really be this man? A husband, a father, a seemingly ordinary figure with a hidden darkness. Or was this just another cruel twist in an already confusing case? The authorities, perhaps desperate to close the chapter, leaned toward believing him. For the families of the victims, it was harder. Some were convinced, others doubted. The lack of physical evidence gnawed at everyone. Still, for the first time in years, Boston felt as though it could exhale, if only for a moment. The Strangler had a name, Albert DeSalvo. But the question that lingered, then and now, was simple and terrifying. Had they really caught the right man? Or had Boston just accepted a confession because it needed an ending? Albert DeSalvo's confessions sent shockwaves through Boston. After years of terror, the city finally had a man who was not only willing to claim the title of Boston Strangler, but who spoke about the murders in unsettling detail. To the public, it sounded like the end of the nightmare. But inside the investigation rooms, unease grew, because for every detail DeSalvo seemed to get right, there was another that didn't fit at all. When questioned by investigators, DeSalvo described scenes that only the killer could have known. He recalled how some victims had been strangled, with nylons tied in distinctive knots. He spoke of the way he posed the bodies after death, often leaving them in positions that disturbed even seasoned detectives. He remembered furniture placement, specific items in rooms, even conversations he claimed to have had with the women before killing them. To detectives who had walked through those apartments, many of his recollections were chillingly accurate. And yet, for every moment of clarity, there were troubling gaps. In some cases, DeSalvo mixed up the names of victims, confusing the order in which they had died. He claimed responsibility for murders that investigators believed didn't match the Strangler-S pattern at all. In one instance, he described an apartment's layout incorrectly, as if he had only heard about it secondhand. The contradictions opened a painful question. Was Albert DeSalvo truly the Boston Strangler, or was he a man desperate for attention, feeding off the infamy that came with the role? Psychologists who studied him noted his hunger for recognition. DeSalvo seemed to crave the spotlight, fascinated by the idea of becoming infamous. Some speculated that confessing to the murders, whether or not he had committed them, was his way of securing a legacy. Twisted as it was, others argued that he might have been coached, fed information by fellow inmates like George Nassar, or even by investigators eager to close the case. Then there was the most damning problem of all. No physical evidence tied him directly to the murders. Not one fingerprint, not one strand of hair, not one piece of forensic proof placed DeSalvo inside the apartments of the victims. In fact, in several of the Strangler murders, the evidence available contradicted aspects of his confession. Without DNA technology, investigators were left with little more than his words, and words, as everyone knew, could be manipulated. For the families of the victims, the confession offered no peace. Some relatives, desperate for closure, accepted DeSalvo's story. Others rejected it outright, insisting he was not the man who had taken their loved ones. The lack of a trial for the Strangler murders only deepened the doubt, because here was the cruel irony. Despite confessing to 13 murders, Albert DeSalvo was never formally charged with them. The state feared that, without hard evidence, a jury would never convict. Instead, prosecutors pursued him for a series of sexual assaults and robberies, crimes they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, not as the Boston Strangler, but as the Green Man, a serial sexual predator. And so the paradox was born. The man who claimed to be the Boston Strangler was locked away, but not for the crimes that had made the world know his name. Officially, the Strangler murders remained unsolved, their files left open in a haze of uncertainty. The controversy ignited debates that still burn today. Was DeSalvo confessing out of guilt, or out of a need for notoriety? Could one man really be responsible for such a wide range of victims, from elderly women to young professionals, killed with such varying methods? Or had multiple killers used the terror of the Boston Strangler legend as a cover for their own crimes? For the police and prosecutors of the 1960s, the decision to accept DeSalvo's confession, without charging him for the murders, was pragmatic. It allowed them to reassure the public that the Strangler was behind bars, even if the truth was less certain. But for historians, criminologists, and true crime investigators, it left a haunting question mark over one of America's most infamous crime sprees. Albert DeSalvo became both an answer and a riddle. To some, he was the face of evil, the man who had shattered Boston's sense of safety. To others, he was a liar, a fraud, a man whose fantasies and manipulations obscured the truth. And behind it all lay the possibility that the real Boston Strangler had never been caught at all. Albert DeSalvo's path through the courts was as strange and unsettling as his confessions. Despite admitting to the murders that paralyzed Boston with fear, he was never actually tried as the Boston Strangler. Instead, prosecutors went after him on charges they could prove: burglary, sexual assault, and robbery. Those crimes were more than enough to secure a conviction. And in 1967, DeSalvo was sentenced to life in prison. To the public, the outcome was confusing. Here was the man who had confessed to being the Strangler, yet the words Boston Strangler were never formally attached to his conviction. Officially, the murders remained unsolved. Unofficially, the city was told to rest easy, because the monster was locked away. It was a compromise, one that would leave behind lingering doubts for decades. Inside prison, DeSalvo remained a paradox. On one hand, he was infamous, the man everyone whispered about in the yard. On the other, he was restless, constantly trying to find a way to exploit his notoriety. He wrote letters, gave interviews, and even hinted at book deals. He wanted people to know his name. It wasn't enough for him to be imprisoned, he wanted to be remembered. He also tried, more than once, to retract his confession. At times, he insisted he was indeed the Boston Strangler. At others, he hinted he had exaggerated or lied. His shifting stories only deepened the mystery. Was he seeking attention, protection, or had he been coerced into confessing in the first place? Every time he opened his mouth, the truth seemed to slip further away. Then, in November 1973, DeSalvo's story came to an abrupt and violent end. At Walpole State Prison in Massachusetts, he was found stabbed to death in the infirmary, his body riddled with wounds. He was only 42 years old. The circumstances of his death raised as many questions as his life. Officially, it was another act of prison violence, the result of disputes among inmates. But some believed it was something more sinister, that DeSalvo had been silenced. There were whispers that he had been on the verge of revealing information, perhaps recanting his confession once and for all, or pointing fingers at someone else. Others suggested he had simply crossed the wrong men inside Walpole, where survival often depended on brutal alliances. Whatever the truth, his murder meant that Albert DeSalvo would never stand trial for the Boston Strangler killings. With him died the possibility of a full courtroom reckoning, where evidence and testimony could have been weighed under oath. Instead, all that remained were his confessions, haunting, inconsistent, and incomplete. To the families of the victims, his death was a cruel epilogue. Some felt cheated of justice. Others believed his silence, one way or another, proved that he had not been the strangler at all. For law enforcement, it was another closed door in a case already filled with them. And yet, DeSalvo's violent end felt almost inevitable. He had lived in the shadows of lies, manipulations, and half-truths. In prison, where secrets and reputations carried deadly weight, that kind of life could only end one way. The irony was bitter. The man who may have taken so many lives was himself taken in an act of senseless violence, leaving behind only questions. The Boston Strangler case, once thought solved, remained suspended in doubt. DeSalvo was gone, but the terror he claimed as his own lived on in the city's memory. And as investigators closed another file on his death, the public was left to wonder. Had the Boston Strangler truly been silenced in a prison cell, or was the real killer still out there, his identity buried beneath a confession that may never have been true? The murders ended in 1964, but the shadow of the Boston Strangler never left Massachusetts. Even after Albert DeSalvo's death in prison, the case refused to settle into neat resolution. Instead, it became a puzzle-haunting chapter in American true crime, where every answer seemed to open more questions. For decades, the debate raged. Was DeSalvo truly the Strangler, or had the city embraced his confession out of desperation? The fact that he had never been tried for the murders left a scar of uncertainty. Historians, criminologists, and journalists dissected his words endlessly, pointing out the contradictions, the errors, the eerie details he did get right. The families of the victims carried the heaviest burden. For some, DeSalvo's name brought a measure of closure, a face to attach to the nightmare. For others, it was an insulting opportunist stealing the legacy of their loved ones' deaths, while the true killer slipped away. As technology advanced, the case was not forgotten. In 2013, nearly 50 years after the murders, DNA testing finally gave investigators something concrete. Samples recovered from the body of Mary Sullivan, the final and youngest victim of the Strangler spree, were compared to genetic material from DeSalvo's relatives. The results were conclusive. Albert DeSalvo's DNA matched. After decades of uncertainty, science proved he was at least guilty of one murder. But even that answer came with its own haunting silence. Mary Sullivan's death tied him undeniably to the killings. But what about the others? Did DeSalvo truly strangle all 13 women? Or had the legend of the Boston Strangler become a convenient cloak for multiple killers? Some experts still believe the latter, that DeSalvo may have been responsible for some murders, but not all. That possibility means the Strangler story may be less about one monster, and more about many men hiding behind one myth. Culturally, the Boston Strangler became immortal. Films, books, and television shows dramatized the murders, each offering their own interpretation of DeSalvo's guilt or innocence. The case became a cautionary tale about vulnerability, trust, and the limits of law enforcement. It changed how Americans thought about safety in their own homes. It forced police departments to re-examine investigative methods, to recognize patterns earlier, to communicate across jurisdictions. And it left an indelible mark on Boston, a city that had to learn to live with the fact that its history was stained not just by revolution, but by fear. Even today, when the name Boston Strangler is spoken, it conjures images of bolted doors, empty streets, and women who no longer trusted the knock of a stranger. It reminds us how fragile the idea of safety can be, how quickly it can unravel when trust is broken. Albert DeSalvo's face remains the face of the case, but his guilt, even with DNA evidence, is still debated. Was he a manipulator who confessed to crimes he did not commit, only to be proven guilty decades later of at least one? Or was he, in truth, the sole hand behind all 13 murders? Perhaps the most terrifying possibility is the one that still lingers, that the Boston Strangler was not one man at all, that the myth swallowed many crimes, committed by many hands, under one name, and that some of those killers never faced justice. For the city of Boston, the legacy is not just in the number of lives lost, but in the lesson left behind, that evil often walks in plain sight, wearing the face of the ordinary, that trust can be a weapon, and that sometimes the answers we accept are only shadows of the truth. So I ask you, the viewer, what do you believe? Was Albert DeSalvo the true Boston Strangler, the man who held a city in fear, or was he merely a man who wanted to be remembered, while the real killer, or killers, slipped away into history? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories from the darkest corners of our past, subscribe to Mr. True Death, because history doesn't just live in the books, it lingers in the shadows, waiting to be told.